I had not realized the many congruencies that I have had with Mike Cox over the years. Mike was a student of mine a few years ago doing a individual study. He would go out and research and come in and we'd talk about what he was doing. And it was one of the most enjoyable and easiest experiences I've had as a teacher. Um, at the time, he had already written quite a few books. Now he has completed 15 different books. Rather impressive number considering he's worked full time and written for the, what is the name of the San Angelo newspaper? I knew it. Standard Times, the San Angelo Standard Times. Starting in 1967, he was a reporter and writer there, and then he came to Austin and worked years having a column with the Austin American Statesman. And he has, at the time I used to go to his bookstore on South Congress. He had a bookstore called State House Books, and I lived in the neighborhood, and I'd go over there and spend afternoons going through his books. And he still sells rare books, and you can go online and find saddlebag books, and you can buy rare Southwestern literature books of his, as addition to his own books. I also was very fond of Fred Gibson, who wrote "Oh Yeller," that you probably have seen the movie about years ago. And one of the first books I ever read by Mike was his biography of Fred Gibson. And I was surprised to discover that I've been interested in history of oil field novels, and that Mike has a book came out in 2008 with images from the early Texas oil fields with his text. He also has a book of photographs about desperados, I guess that would be the right term, and he has written on many tales of the Texas Rangers. He worked for years as for the Texas Department of Public Safety, and that Texas Rangers comes under the aegis of that organization, and he has done much research on it. In fact, he has done enough research to leave a lot out and still have over 1,000 pages of the two manuscripts. The one that came out in 2008 called "The Texas Rangers Wearing the Cinco Peso," 1832 was it to 1900, 1830, 1900. And then this year he came out with the 502-page book on the same subject, starting in 1900 and bringing it up to the present. So it takes a lot of research and a lot of work to come up with that kind of information. And I'm impressed, and I want you to have an opportunity to hear him now. Mike, thanks for coming.
Thanks. I'm glad to see this many people here on such a beautiful day. The first thing I'd tell you is thank you. I mean, as I was driving here, I thought, do I really want to come and talk today? I mean, it's so pretty outside. I'd just as soon be out fishing. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm here already. What has not been mentioned is that I've already donated a bunch of my papers to the Wittliff collection. And I'm very honored to do that because, as I understand, not just anybody can give their old junk to this institution. Now, I fell a little short. They did not offer me $1 million for my papers. Yeah, but yeah, they invested that in the collection in my honor. So, but I'm proud to be here, and I've got more of my material that's going to be coming here. And as Dr. Haeberlin said, I am a former Texas State University student, and I'd be proud to stand here and tell you that I was a graduate. But what I tell people is that I have a unique degree after about 130 some odd hours of study. It's called an ABA. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but that stands for all but algebra, and that's what my degree is in. So I figure at this point in my career that what I'll just do is hold out for an honorary degree Maybe if I keep giving papers and keep giving papers and keep writing books. I was introduced the other day, and they said that I'd written the number of books I have, and somebody in the audience said, "Is that all?" But anyway, I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the Texas Rangers. I want to acknowledge a couple of people first. My wife Linda here in the front row played a big role, and I've acknowledged her in my dedication of both my Ranger books. In cowboy Texas terms, she kept the campfire burning while I spent my time researching and spending an awful lot of time writing. And then next to her is Beth Warren, who works for the Department of Public Safety, and I had the privilege of stealing her from the driver's license division, I guess it was, way back when I worked there. And she had a long career inside the Public Information Office there at DPS that I used to preside over until about a year ago, and they transferred her into another part of the agency. I just found out. But I ran into her in the parking garage coming up, and I rolled down my window, and I said, "Hi, Beth," and she came over, and she looked in my SUV, and she said, "I guess I know what you want me to do. You want me to help you, right?" And so she very graciously helped haul books up here, which I was telling Dick is the sort of physical side of being a gentleman author and gentleman bookseller, is hauling all that stuff. And so I've yet to get to the point where I have a professional retinue to follow me around to do that. But since we're here in a center about writing, I want to tailor the normal talk that I do on the Rangers a little bit and talk a little bit about writing about the Texas Rangers and how I came to write about the Rangers. My interest in Texas history goes back pretty far. My late grandfather was a Texas newspaper man. He used to tell me he took his first picture on the Capitol grounds in 1914. Started a newspaper out in Big Lake during the bandit era along the Mexican border in 1915 called the Big Lake News. And then he went on to about a 25 or so year career as a newspaper writer, and then later an editor. He was city editor of the old Fort Worth Press, and later on he was city editor of the old Herald Post in El Paso. Then he segued into Chamber of Commerce work. Well, one of his first job in Chamber of Commerce work was as executive director of the El Paso Chamber of Commerce. It was called something else back then. But this was back in about 37 or so, I think, is when he took that job, maybe 38. He was instrumental in starting the Sun Bowl as a promotional way to get people into El Paso, started the Sun Bowl parade. Well, one of the people that he was able to get to be the first Grand Marshal of the parade was an old Texas Ranger by the name of Captain John R. Hughes. Hughes had retired in 1915 before the state of Texas even had a formal retirement program. He was an old-time border ranger. He'd spent most of his career in El Paso. He actually started in Williamson County at Georgetown in 1887, and his career went from 1887 to 1915, which sounds relatively short, but back then that was a lifetime in ranger service. Most of these rangers, except for a few of the captains in this early era, some of them only served 6 months. A long career might be 3 or 4 years in the Texas Rangers, but Hughes went on and on and on. Well, anyway, as a newspaper man, my grandfather had a chance to meet Captain Hughes. The old man befriended my grandfather. Sure, he would have been. Hughes was born back in the late 1850s, I think. So he was pretty old by that point. Maybe in the 1860s he was born. But anyway, my grandfather was substantially younger than that. But they got to be friends. My grandfather took a lot of pictures of him. Any time you see a picture of John R. Hughes, most of those pictures were probably taken by my grandfather. They eventually got to be good enough friends where he gave my grandfather an old brush-scarred 30-30 lever-action rifle that he had carried as a Texas Ranger, and I'll tell you more about that particular weapon in a minute. My mother used to tell me that for Sunday dinner, often the captain would show up. My grandfather was a good fried chicken cook, Most of you, I think, are probably from Texas and understand that when I say Sunday dinner, I mean Sunday lunch. The people from out of state might possibly refer to dinner as an evening meal, but you and I from Texas know that dinner is supper in Texas, or supper is dinner in Texas. But my grandmother, or my mother remembers sitting in the old ranger's lap and pulling on his beard and listening to him tell my grandfather stories. Well, the upshot of all this is that by the time I was a kid in the late 1950s, beginning to get old enough to be interested in Texas and Texas history, and of course, you just saw the demise of Fess Parker. I mean, I was a dyed in the wound Davy Crockett fan, wore my coonskin cap, and so most of us who grew up, who were born in the late 40s, were really into the Old West anyway. And so to have somebody in my family who had personal connection to a piece of the Old West, well, that was very cool to me as a young person. And so I listened to a lot of stories that my granddad told me about Captain Hughes, and that got me started getting me interested in the Texas Rangers. Then my grandfather also would tell me stories about other Rangers that he knew during his newspaper career. And I'll jump a little bit ahead of my chronological story and stick with telling about my granddad. But two of the more notable Rangers that he knew, one was Captain Frank Haeber, who later became pretty famous for presiding over the demise of the outlaw couple Bonnie and Parker in 1934. But Granddad knew Haeber back in the 1920s when he was a newspaperman, a newspaper editor. There was another Ranger captain named Tom Hickman who was stationed in Fort Worth. He was in command of Company B in Fort Worth. Well, Dick mentioned oil. In 1926, oil was discovered in the Texas Panhandle, and a promoter from Oklahoma came in and started a town that he thought it would be quite suitable to name in his honor, and so he named it Borger. His name was Asa Borger, and he named the town Borger. Borger quickly mushroomed, became a classic Texas oil field town, and by the late 1920s, it got so bad that the good people in Borger actually assassinated their district attorney. And so the law enforcement was something of an issue in Hutchinson County, and it got so out of hand that Governor Dan Moody did something that's pretty unusual in Texas history, and that is he declared a state of martial law in Hutchinson County, Texas, and sent in several companies of Texas National Guard troops, and he also sent in 2 companies of Texas Rangers. One company of Rangers came from Austin, and it was commanded by Frank Haeber. It went to Fort Worth, picked up Company B from Fort Worth under this Captain Tom Hickman, and then from there they proceeded to Borger to calm things down. Well, Tom Hickman and my granddad were in the same Sunday school class in Fort Worth. They were friends. Hickman and Haeber were 2 different types of law enforcement officers. Now, both of them were good shots, and you didn't want to mess with either one of them. But Haeber did not care very much for the news media. In fact, back in his time, they did not use such lofty terms as news media. They were just damn reporters to these early day Texas Rangers. Hickman, on the other hand, loved to see his picture in the paper, loved to pose for pictures, loved to be quoted in the newspaper. One of his better friends was my grandfather, who was a newspaper editor. So, his name and photograph and information about him appeared in print quite often. Okay, so another interesting thing about the news media, or damn reporters back in that era, a very dangerous trend that I'm glad that did not continue into my era as in dealing with the news media at the DPS, and that was that for political purposes, sheriffs and chief of police would often issue commissions to reporters or editors, which means that they were empowered legally to carry a gun. So my grandfather had a gun, but it wasn't much of a gun. He had a little .25 semi-automatic that very gentlemanly he carried in his vest pocket. Because as a newspaper editor, he got into some rough situations sometimes, and it was always handy to be toting a piece. And he had a badge that said Fort Worth Police Department that enabled him to legally do so. Well, on the train, my granddad rode up with the 2 Ranger companies, somewhere between Fort Worth and Borger, or actually they had to go to Amarillo and then to Fort Worth. on the Santa Fe, the clickety-clack of the rails lulled my grandfather to sleep. And when he woke up, Hamer, who was, like 6 foot forever, was standing over my grandfather, palming that little 25 up and down like that. He'd fished it out of his vest pocket. And my granddad said that Hamer used to brag that he could smell a gun on someone. And, Hamer, other people have said he had supervision. He could see a bullet. I don't know if that's true or not, but my granddad swears that he had given no clue whatsoever that he was packing. And that Hamer found this pistol and was standing over him when he woke up. Well, Hamer looked down at him and kind of, disdainfully regarded that pistol in his hand for a second. He looked at my grandfather and he said, "Wilkie," he said, "you better not ever shoot me with that damn thing and let me find out about it." He said, "When I go to hub a little hell, I want a 45. And, of course, the old Ranger slogan is, somebody asked a Ranger one time, "How come you carry a 45? And he said, "Because they don't make a 46. But, so anyway, they get to Borger. And the point of all this is, these are stories that I grew up hearing as a kid, and you can see, I hope, how it began to get me interested in the history of the Texas Rangers. They get to Borger, and again, because of the first thing they did was run all the prostitutes out of town. They ran 1,600 prostitutes out of Borger, Texas, in 24 hours' time. And just to make sure it stuck, the Rangers went around to all the dry cleaning establishments in town and confiscated all the dresses of the women and donated them to what few churches there were in town, just to make sure that they stayed gone. Well, and then of course then they set about the serious work, which was to try to run off the killers and the bootleggers and the gamblers and all the other riffraff. They had a very simple, non-constitutional technique that really, in a rough community, would still work to this day. Unfortunately, I'm sure it would be tremendously illegal. But what the Rangers would do, if they had a suspicion about somebody, they would come up and, without asking, they would grab that person's hands and they would look down at their hands and examine their fingernails. Well, if they were all oily and calloused and dirty, the Rangers figured it was probably just a good old boy, hard-working roughneck who was up there trying to make an honest living. If, however, they got a man who had nicely manicured, smooth, uncalloused hands, he went to the calahoose because he more than likely was a pimp or a gambler or running a speakeasy or something like that. Like I say, not very constitutional, but very, very pretty effective as a tool to calm things down there in the oil field. Well, so anyway, they get up there. My grandfather's there representing the Fort Worth Press. There's another reporter from the Houston Press, and at that time those two newspapers, long extinct, were connected, owned by the same company. And so my grandfather and this other reporter were working together and covering this military takeover of this Texas city. Because of my grandfather's connection to Captain Hickman, surprise, surprise, the Fort Worth Press was getting scoops over the larger and bigger staffed Fort Worth Star-Telegram and other newspapers in Texas. And of course the same stories were running in the Houston paper. Well, this was beginning to annoy Frank Hamer. He didn't like it. I guess he finally figured out probably where it was coming from. But my grandfather told me this story. He said that at one point my grandfather and the reporter from Houston were standing there talking somewhere amidst the chaos of Borger, and Hamer came up between them. He interjected himself between them, draped one big old arm over my granddad and one big old arm over this reporter from Houston. And he said, "Well, now I know how Jesus Christ felt, crucified between two thieves," and walked off. So that's what Hamer felt about the news media. My granddad said it's just a lucky thing Hamer worked for the press. For the state. Granddad lived to be 87 years old, and he said that Hamer had the coldest, deadest eyes on any man that he ever met in his 87 years of life. When they buried Hamer, he had about 7 pieces of lead in him and 17 bullet wound scars. For a man who lived such a violent life, he died of a heat stroke in Austin in 1957. But anyway, so that's how I got interested in the Texas Rangers. Then I followed family tradition. I, too, became a newspaper reporter. I dealt with the Rangers during the late 1960s. As Dick said, out in San Angelo, I worked for the newspaper out there. And In 1968, I remember one time, the last time anything big happened in El Dorado, Texas. You know, the most recent time something big happened in El Dorado was when the Mormons got busted there for their little escapades that were going on. Prior to that, it was some oil field vandalism that was attendant to a oil field strike in 1968. So the Standard Times sent me down there with a camera, and I arrive, and I find not one but two Texas Rangers in El Dorado, Texas, investigating this vandalism of this battery of oil tanks. One of the Rangers I knew fairly well. He was stationed in Ozona and periodically came up to San Angelo, and so I already knew him. The other one I knew more casually. He was out of Alpine. And so I walked up to the one that I knew, and I said, now, wait a minute. What, you know, I've always heard this legend of one ranger, one riot, but here we have just one oil field vandalism case, but we've got two Texas Rangers. And without missing a beat, this ranger looked at me and he said, Mike, he said, Arthur Hill's here for the vandalism. I'm here for you. So I thought that was pretty good to be compared to, as a young reporter, to a riot. But, you know, throughout the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, I dealt a lot with the Department of Public Safety and the Texas Rangers, various captains, as a newspaper editor and reporter myself. So 1985, I ended up going to work for the Department of Public Safety as a public information officer. In baseball terms, that would be like being an Astros fan and suddenly you get a job working for the front office of the baseball team. I mean, you know, it was like they were paying me money to hang out with people that I'd heard about all my life, or of course the generational descendants of those people, and deal with them. And it was a fine, action-packed career that I was able to stand for 15 years. I finally got a little tired of the 4 o'clock in the morning phone calls and having to hop in a helicopter or a plane and go to, you know, the wilds of West Texas or somewhere else on a moment's notice. And so I left the Department of Public Safety. Still have a lot of friends there, people like Beth. But again, by this time, I'm dealing with these folks every day, and so I decided, you know, I ought to do a book on the Texas Rangers. Well, the first book I did was actually a children's book that Ed Aiken, who at that time ran a press called Aiken Press, kind of talked me into doing, and I was real reluctant about doing it. I'd never written for children before, other than, you know, that 6th grade level you're supposed to aspire to when you're writing a newspaper story. But other than that, I never had. But I went ahead and did it, and it's proven to be a very successful book. It's still in print. It came out in 1991. It's in about its 8th or 9th printing now, and within a year or so we're going to be updating that book. Well, then I had always, or for years, I had been collecting books and information on the Texas Rangers, and so I decided to do a book that I ended up calling Texas Ranger Tales, which is just a collection of nonfiction, freestanding stories on the Rangers. Like, for instance, I had a chapter in that book on Borger. I used a picture of my grandfather that he'd given me as a young newspaper man holding a newspaper in his hand with his snap brim hat on, and some of his recollections about being in Borger. That book also did fairly well. It came out in 1997, and so I followed that up with a volume 2 called Texas Ranger Tales, Roman numeral 2, very imaginative. And both of those two books are still in print. Well, in 1999, my wife will vouch for this, for years, probably before that, I had been saying, you know, I really want to write a definitive history of the entire Texas Ranger organization. And eventually I decided to do that. I was able to interest a New York publishing house in taking the project on. So in 1999, I swore and subscribed on a contract that I would finish a history of the Texas Rangers in 18 months, which would have been published in early 2000 or so, maybe 2001. Well, the volume 1 of that book finally came out in March of 2008. Volume 2 of that book came out in September of 2009. Fortunately, I had a very patient editor, Bob Gleason, who's still there. And at various times, you know, he'd check in with me or I'd check in with him, and I said, I'm sorry, you know, I'm still working on it. He said, that's okay. He said, I know you're going to write a good book. You know, legally, he could have hung me up, you know, and demanded the book or demanded my advance back or a portion of my advance that he'd paid me. But he didn't do that. He was very patient, and for that I'm very appreciative. I don't want you to think this is a complete love note to that publisher, because I have had my issues with them over other things, but I do respect them and appreciate that they did that. So I finally got the manuscript turned in 2005. I waited and waited, didn't hear anything, and so I called New York and I said, well, I sent you the manuscript, I haven't heard anything from you. And they said, you did? And I'd emailed it to them, and their firewall had bounced it out or something, and so they didn't even know that, that I had done that, and so I'd lost another 3 or 4 months waiting to hear from those guys. So I sent it again. This time I was smart enough to call, immediately thereafter and say, did you get it? And they said yes. And so once again, of course, you hear this expression faster than like in a New York minute, but that only exists their way. That doesn't exist all the time. That exists when they want it to be, but not when you necessarily want it to be. So again, I went a good while without hearing anything, and finally the editor called, and he said, well, Mike, I really like your book. And the way he said it, it was like, uh-oh, there's another shoe about to fall here, and I may not like the sound that it makes. He said, it's kind of long, and when he said that, I thought, oh man, he's going to tell me to cut it. But he didn't. He said, I like it so much. He said, I want to turn it into a 2-volume history of the Texas Rangers. And he said, that'll just make you more money. And I said, well, who am I to argue with that? I can't fuss about that. So, and that actually ended up giving me more time to work on, not only on the first volume, but a lot more time to work on the second volume. In fact, I was still writing on the second volume about this time last year. And I had to rewrite the book, the ending, several times, because I wanted to work in the growing border drug conflict that's going on right now. And I was able to get in the fact that the Rangers were gearing up for that. The legislature appropriated more money to hire more Texas Rangers. And we'll talk about more of that in a minute. Well, what I tried to do in this book was to, I was very concerned as a writer and as an old journalist that since I had been a spokesman for the DPS for 15 years, that I might get accused by readers and or reviewers of being overly partial to the agency and trying to do just a puff piece. And I did not want to do that. I mean, I wanted to tell it straight down the middle in as close to journalistic fashion as I possibly could. And so I tell people, with apologies to Clint Eastwood, I tried to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly about the Texas Rangers. And I'll give you an example of each of those from my research and incidents that are in the book. A good example of the good, and I could certainly pick more, happened in the fall of 1858. A ranger company in Mills County was out on a routine patrol, which in that era was sort of unusual. They never had enough money in that era. I mean, even the modern Rangers will tell you they probably don't have nearly as much budget authority as they'd like, but back then it was really bad. They couldn't always have enough money to field a force. So it was kind of a hit-and-miss proposition. But in this case, there was a company afoot, or field, and they were out looking for trouble. And they soon found trouble. They found a set of pony tracks and started following those. They realized they were Comanches, and they followed the pony tracks to an abandoned cabin. It wasn't abandoned, but the people in it had gone. And these old rangers could read tracks, like you and I can read a newspaper or a book. I mean, they can look down and just see an obscure collection of impressions in the dirt, and they can tell you what happened based on looking at that. And so they could tell from these tracks that a wagon had left this cabin and was headed toward Pecan Bayou, which they call a bayou, but it's actually a river. It's a tributary of the Colorado River. The Rangers could also tell that these Comanches were following that wagon. And as the Rangers continued to ride on, they eventually rode up to a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie where they find the smoking remnants of the wagon, the mutilated remains of the husband and the mother, and their older daughters who had been raped and killed. And from the tracks, though, they could tell that the 2 youngest children in the group had been taken alive, apparently. And so the Rangers continued following this set of pony tracks. They ride to the northwest, to the middle of nowhere in Texas. The weather turns bad. They run out of food. The lieutenant in charge has to make the hard decision to turn around and go back to the settlements to reprovender and get some warmer clothing. But as soon as they did that, they turned around and back trailed themselves again in search of these Indians. Finally, just in the wilds of West Texas, and you know, much anything west of this area in that period of time was the wilds of West Texas. A ranger just happened to look down, and he spotted a piece of torn cloth in a brush, and so he knew that was unusual because they were so far removed from civilization. So he got off his horse and he kind of bent down to look under this bush, and sure enough, two little sets of eyes looked back out at him from underneath this bush, and it was the two kids. The kids had escaped the Indians. They were so far out that the Comanches apparently were confident that they would not try to escape, but you know, pure instinct and fear, or instinct-born fear took over, and these kids ran, even though they were too young really to know what they were doing, and would have soon died from hypothermia out there in the middle of nowhere like that. But because the Rangers found them, that ended up saving their lives. The lieutenant in command had to make another hard decision, and that was, well, do I keep riding after the Indians, or do I, cut my losses and get these two kids back to what's left of their family? And he opted for the, I think, more humane choice of getting the kids back to their family. To me, that's the good that the Texas Rangers did back, especially in the 19th century. Now, an example of the bad happened in the 1870s, early 1870s. A ranger company was being recruited in Austin, and back in the 1870s, and really for a long time after that, hiring standards with the state of Texas were not nearly as exacting as they are today. In fact, to be a Texas Ranger back in this particular period of time, really about all you needed to do was be able to know how to ride a horse and shoot. English as whatever first or second language was certainly an option, but not really critical. As long as you could ride and shoot, hey, you were a Texas Ranger. So they recruited this company of Rangers in Austin, and because of these lower standards, no background checking, no testing, nothing like they do today, they hired a group of men, and they headed out toward Erath County, where they were supposed to be stationed. Well, one of the men that they had hired was just an out-and-out thief from Austin, and he soon proved it, because every time they would get anywhere near a small community, he'd ride off from the company, steal the town blind, then come back, rejoin the Rangers, and they would proceed north toward Erath County. Well, during this period of time, friction was beginning to develop between the ranger who was a thief and a ranger who was not. And the issue, interestingly enough, was not so much because the ranger was a thief, but just because the two rangers didn't hit it off. I mean, there just somehow friction developed there, and it escalated first from a cussing match, then to a fist fight, and finally one morning, the rangers were sitting around their campfire drinking their morning coffee, and the ranger who was annoyed with the thief just walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head and killed him in front of all these other Texas Rangers. Well, that was too far even for these Texas Rangers. Nobody liked the thief. I mean, but the Rangers just couldn't abide by the fact that somebody would back shoot one of their own. If he was going to kill him, he at least should have shot him, front on instead of shooting him behind the back like that. So the Rangers thought, well, the only way to adjudicate this would be just to go ahead and get a rope and hang this ranger right now. And so somebody went out to find a rope, and they were going to, a la Lonesome Dove, they were going to string up this ranger for killing the thief, when the commander, again, the captain, interceded and reminded them that they were about protecting law and order and not enforcing the law themselves. And he said, we got to take this man into for civil authorities to handle this murder case. And indeed, that's what they ended up doing. They did not lynch the man. I found this story because another one of the Rangers ended up becoming a preacher, and he wrote a recollection about his adventures as a Texas Ranger, and I found that story in there, and I couldn't resist it and use it for my book. Interestingly enough, a lot of Rangers either were very religious people or moved off into some form of ministry after they got through being a ranger. But there was one ranger captain of a later era, in the later 1800s, who actually was a deacon in his church and always carried a Bible with him. And his thesis was that if he couldn't preach the gospel into somebody, he'd shoot the hell out of them, quite happily. And really, again, that was a pretty effective balance. So that's an example of what I would consider the bad. Well, let me tell you now just what I consider the plain old ugly. And that happened in 1874. A ranger company was up in Menard County, and they got into a tussle again with a bunch of Comanche Indians. The Rangers won. They killed all but one Indian. There was one particular ranger named Scott Cooley. And Scott Cooley, depending on which source you look at, either his parents had been killed by Indians when he was real young, which sounds kind of Hollywoodish, or somebody in his family had had a loss to an Indian attack. But anyway, for whatever the reason, he did not like Native Americans. He was often known to literally, after killing them, to take a piece of their skin off and braid it into a quirt to use to inspire his horse to faster speeds. So he was not, a touchy-feely kind of guy. And with this one prisoner that they had, an Indian whose name turned out to be Little Bull, again, this guy, Scott Cooley, was going to just execute him right there on the spot. And once again, in this case, it was a lieutenant who was in command. He interceded and he said, no, we do not kill prisoners. We're going to take this Indian to Austin. So that's what they did. They put the Indian on a mule, their pack mule, and they traveled from Menard County through Fredericksburg and into Mason, Menard County, and then into Austin. They crossed into Austin on the south side of the river. There was no bridge, of course, at that time. They forded the river. They rode north up Congress Avenue, trailing this Comanche Indian behind them on a mule. The whole town turned out, all the saloons emptied, the businesses emptied to see this wild Indian. Because this was 1874. By 1874, Austin was a pretty pacific place. There were a lot of people in Austin who'd never seen an Indian by 1874. The last time Indians had been much trouble in Travis County was back in the 1840s. So there was a whole generation of people living there who had never seen an Indian, as I said. So they come up to Congress Avenue. They turn left, and the lieutenant had told them, well, take him to the governor. Well, evidently security at the governor's mansion was about as bad then as it is now, because they took the Indian straight in to see Governor Richard Coke without any formalities or anything. And the governor just took one look at him and said, I didn't ask for any Indians. And so they didn't know what to do with him, so they booked him into the Travis County Jail, perhaps the first prisoner of war ever booked into the Travis County Jail. At some point along the way, perhaps in one of those bars on Congress Avenue, Ranger Scott Cooley had an idea. And then as now, state of Texas is never known for overpaying its employees. And back then, these rangers got $30 a month, whether they wanted it or not. And out of that, they had to deduct the cost of their six-shooter and their Winchester and pay the state of Texas back for that. So they didn't have a whole lot of money. Well, Cooley had this idea. I guess he'd taken note of how much attraction the Indian was getting as he drove up the avenue with him. And so he went to Miller's Opera House in Austin and conspired with the owner of the Opera House to print handbills and circulate them in town, announcing that a wild Indian lately captured by the Texas Rangers would be on public display for consideration of 25 cents a head at the Miller's Opera House. And so the good people of Austin, this was before Austin was officially weird, but they still would turn out to pay a quarter to see a wild Indian. And my gosh! So they got a good crowd for a performance or two there at the Opera House, and this ranger would bring the Indian out on the stage, and they'd do their own little Wild West show there for the great enjoyment of the crowd, and they were raking in lots of money. But once again, even though that's just about as ugly as you can get to be displaying and making money off of a captive Indian, the Adjutant General of Texas, who at that time was oversaw the Texas Rangers, heard about what was going on and just hit the ceiling. I mean, he said that's not right. I mean, this guy was a fighter himself. He was a Confederate, a veteran. He'd been an officer in the Civil War, but that, in his opinion, again, was carrying things too far, and so he quashed any further performances involving Little Bull. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that story had a happy ending. They ended up taking Little Bull to Huntsville, to the state prison, and he got a disease there, and within a couple of years he was dead. But at least he was not any further humiliated in Austin. So that's an example of some of the ugly that they did. I really don't have a whole lot of patience with some of the revisionist historians who have tried to paint the Rangers as, you know, just tools of the white establishment in Texas, you know, who killed for land and practiced genocide. From what I've read and what I've seen, I just don't think that was the case. I think that most of these guys thought they were just doing their job, thought they were protecting the families along the frontier. Now, I will say, of course, and as I've said all along, I'm not at all trying to whitewash some of the things they did that were not right, and I've shared some of them with you today. It got particularly bad about 100 years ago, shortly after the Mexican Revolution broke out. By 1915, for all practical purposes, there was a guerrilla war underway in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Mexican nationals of various political stripe were raiding into Texas. They were overturning trains. They were killing people. They were cutting power lines. They were destroying irrigation pumps. You know, they were conducting a guerrilla war in the state of Texas, to which the U.S. military responded, as well as the Texas Rangers. In fact, the governor brought every ranger in Texas to the Rio Grande Valley. Yes, a lot of Mexicans were killed. Some of them, I'm sure, were quite innocent. Can you believe my phone is ringing here while I'm giving a talk? We'll just turn that off. Nobody I know. I had that happen one time. It was my mother, but she's no longer with me, so I don't know what to... But anyway, that was a period that they've gotten a lot of criticism for. Certainly some of that criticism is justified. But again, I think it's been overpainted. I don't think they killed as many people as they've been credited with killing. There were never any records, of course, kept. The legend is that, you know, skulls with 45 caliber holes in the center of their forehead were still being found in citrus groves in the Rio Grande Valley into the 1940s and 50s. Maybe. But certainly there were some abuses, but I just don't think there were that many abuses. Now, the happy ending is here that really for each successive decade after that time, the Rangers have continued to professionalize. They've got more and more legislative scrutiny. They have they've gotten to the point now where after I left the Department of Public Safety, they had, for several years, they had an African American who was the senior captain of the Texas Rangers, the highest ranking Texas Ranger. Right now they have a Hispanic who is the senior captain of the Texas Rangers. He's also the youngest they've ever had. He went in at the age of 44 and probably will be around for a good while because of that young age. And so things have totally reversed. I'll never forget when I was still with the Department of Public Safety when a U.S. Marine, depending on your perspective, either intentionally or accidentally, shot and killed a young Mexican goat herder in the Big Bend. The Rangers, I mean, I know, because I know the people who were involved in that case, they wanted to put that Marine in prison. I mean, they thought it was a murder, and they were angry about it. I mean, they took it personally, and I can still, most of them are retired now, but you could still get an animated conversation out of several Rangers that I could name you about that incident. So I think they swung around. I think that you know, the bad things that did happen are in the past, and now, you know, I think they are back to the point where they really sort of match their legend. You know, they actually are to a point now of you know, living up to that long myth that they've had. So it's been my pleasure to write about the Rangers. I don't think I'm going to be able to live long enough to write a volume 3 that would at least cover much territory. I'm in good health, but we need a few decades to pass now. I think the Rangers are very much involved in a very quiet, little-known posture right now along the Mexican border. It didn't get much publicity, but there was a short story that announced that Governor Perry had invoked a plan that they can't discuss that is a ramp up, and I know enough of the Rangers that I've talked to know the Rangers are deeply involved in that. And frankly, I am a little bit worried that one of these days we are going to have a spillover and possibly a return to what we had a century ago, where we're going to end up with groups of Texas Rangers in firefights possibly with Mexican nationals on the Mexican border. I think that's a distinct possibility. I know one retired ranger who spent his entire career in Laredo. When he was there, his relationship with our sister republic were so cordial that he actually had a commission as a judiciale in Tamaulipas, a state policeman. He could carry his gun across the river. He virtually operated internationally. And he said, I wouldn't cross that bridge with a machine gun. He said somebody would just kill me for that machine gun. I mean, it's that bad down there now. And so somebody else will certainly have plenty to write about down the road. I'll be happy to practice my old skills and take any questions that any of you might have. Yes, ma'am. Well, until the legislature meets again, there are 134. They may get some more funding. However, the next session looks like it's going to be pretty bleak financially, so they may not. But right now it's 134, which is as large as they've been any time since the Mexican Revolution. When I came there, they were still in the high 90s. I think they had 96 or something when I was there. When I was a reporter, I remember distinctly when they just had 62. So they've grown by, say, about 62 from the mid-60s up to 134 today. But still, it's a lead organization. It may have changed, but when I was there, it was not unusual for 200 people to apply for one ranger opening. A lot of I think it's a good analogy to kind of compare the ranger mindset to a Marine mindset, sort of the few, the proud, the brave, and they're very, very conscious. They're hugely conscious of their image. I mean, they to a man and to a woman. There's three lady rangers now, maybe, which is about the maximum that there's been. But they are well aware of their tradition, and they don't want to be the guy or a woman to mess up that tradition anymore. So, I think right now we're in pretty good shape with them. Yes, sir. You had a question. Sure. Yeah, sure. I think that's where a lot of the friction along the border developed, because these rangers were actually in federal service, as you said, but they went by the name Texas Ranger. All the regular military officers disdained them because they were rough boys. I mean, they drank and caterwauled around and had a good time, and they were vicious. One of them kind of paraphrased Sam Houston's old line about, they're good fighters, but damn their manners. They were really pretty rough. And I think a lot of the violence that they enacted during the Mexican War is one of the factors that probably contributed to that bubble that has existed for a long time along the border. I know to some extent it's still there. I think it's lesser than it used to be. But yes, that's certainly something. You had a second question? Mm. Uh-huh. Well, certainly Jack Hayes, for whom Hayes County is named, was one of the early ranger captains who helped establish the ranger legend. He was quite effective. He was quite young when he was in Texas, but he quickly developed a reputation for not only fearlessness, but also being a good strategic thinker. He was the first. He commanded the first Ranger company that used the 6-shooter. Actually, it was a 5-shooter at the time against the Comanche Indians, which was the equivalent of having an atomic bomb in that era. The Indians were used to fighting people who only had one shot, and they had to stop and reload. And they discovered the hard, painful way the first time they faced these Rangers armed with the 5-shooters. That's one thing the Rangers have always been pretty good about, is keeping up with modern technology to the extent they can. Now, of course, it's passé now, but when I was there, it was still pretty cool. They all had laptops and cell phones, and that reliance on technology has only grown. The same retired Ranger I'm telling you about who had the commission to go into Mexico, when he was issued a laptop computer, he used it as a doorstop for his office in Laredo. He never He never plugged it in, never learned how to use it. It got so bad that his lieutenant would have to come down from San Antonio and empty out his email account and everything. He just wouldn't do it. He was just that old school, and he was not going to have any of this high tech stuff. But now they're all younger, and it's amazing what they can do. I've had one ranger was telling me that they can, since they have statewide jurisdiction. One ranger in South Texas might be working a murder case, and they might arrest a suspect in Tyler, say. And in a day's time, that ranger in South Texas can have, the fingerprint, the mug shot, perhaps a sworn statement taken by his ranger colleague in Tyler from the bad guy, and go into the district attorney and say, well, okay, got that case cleared. Let's take it to the grand jury. I mean, even when I was there, that was the kind of stuff that you had to put in the mail or fax. Remember, anybody, all remember these antiquated things like fax machines, and it's just changed so fast. But they're able to use that to their benefit, or to your benefit. Yes, sir. Hmm? Dick, go ahead. Yeah, they are a division inside the Department of Public Safety. They've hugely changed the organizational structure since I left, and now I think there's several more layers in the bureaucracy than there used to be when I was there. But still, the individual ranger has a pretty good amount of latitude. Usually, in almost every case, really, they wait for an invitation. They wait for some county sheriff to say, "Hey, I got a murder here. It looks like a whodunit. Can you come in and give me some help?" And the reason these sheriffs, especially the rural sheriffs, like this is because these guys have got a lot of training, perhaps more training than a local sheriff's deputy, who's not paid as much and just has not had as much opportunity as these rangers have. Plus, they've got all the forensic arm of the DPS behind them. But in terms of assigning cases, well, most of it's handled through their captain, and now they have a pretty good layer of lieutenants in there too, and so. But still, in most cases, it just takes a sheriff calling an individual ranger and saying, "Hey, I need your help," and they head out. Now, if it's a corruption investigation, if it looks like there's a crooked sheriff or a crooked county official or something, usually that comes down from the director of the DPS. A district attorney, for instance, might ask the DPS to investigate an official that they have some suspicions about. So they're very conscious of the politics, and most of the time they like to keep a low profile, and even if they were instrumental in solving a murder, go ahead and let the sheriff take the political credit for it, which is arguably a good system. Yes, sir. Just a little bit. I do talk about it. The Rangers were involved in that. Of course, the Rangers were also used as, some would say, strike breakers during the 40s and 50s. Others would say they were just there to keep the peace. More realistically, they were strike breakers. But they're totally out of that business now, and they don't do anything like that. And they were involved. The oil field, of course, was a boon for the Rangers. Primarily for law enforcement reasons, but they got involved in the slant oil drilling. Later on, when it became popular to steal mercury from oil field sites, the Rangers were deeply involved in investigations of that sort. So, whatever new technology arises, it always begets crime of some nature. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. They were active. Sometimes they get involved in things they don't like to. They never liked working gambling cases. They thought that was a local law enforcement matter. They'd much prefer to work a major felony crime. They were instrumental in cleaning up Galveston, but not really because they wanted to, because they had an attorney general that said clean up Galveston, and ditto for the chicken ranch. Yes, ma'am. Well, still the DPS does not, unless they've changed this, they still don't require a degree. You have to have at least 60 hours of college credit, and of course they prefer military experience. But you have to have 8 years of law enforcement experience before you can take the Ranger test for the first time. And generally, because they start off in the academy and they have to build that 8 years up, usually a Ranger is 30 years old or so before they get a chance to take the test, which is good too, because by that time they've had a chance to season up a little bit. Now I'll tell you, in the older days, under previous directors, prior to about 1981 or so, the director of the DPS could do what's called a direct appointment. He might know of a sheriff who been around for 30 years and had handled all sorts of cases and had a real good reputation. He might say, hey, I'll appoint you a Ranger if you'd like to take it. Or he might, pick a homicide cop in Dallas who's seen 1,000 dead bodies and say, hey, I'd like to have you as a Texas Ranger. And so, you're getting some real world experience coming in, but a director came in and decided that, no, let's raise our own. And so that's one of those sort of things I can argue both ways. I mean, if you raise your own, you control the training and they are real familiar with the culture and that sort of thing. But if you bring in somebody from outside, you're bringing in fresh blood, fresh ideas. But that's the system now. Well, thank you all. Enjoyed it. Just happen to have some copies of my book out front. And I tell people, unlike Pete Rose, I don't charge for an autograph. So.